Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Dania Thafer. I'm the Executive Director at Gulf International Forum. I'm very pleased to host you all for a special book talk for a book by Dr. Courtney Freer called The Resilience of Parliamentary Politics in Kuwait, Parliament, Rentierism, and Society. Um, and this is, I believe, to be the first English language book that assesses the Kuwaiti political history from the perspective of the parliament. And this book offers a comprehensive analysis of contemporary Kuwaiti politics, marking the first such study in this over this particular issue in the last 2 decades. It intricately nests the nation's politics into a broader conversation concerning authoritarianism's constraints, and the practice of democracy in the Arab world, particularly within an affluent oil producing nation such as Kuwait. Dr. Freer, in her book, places Kuwaiti political dynamics within the broader discourse of political science, which questions the efficacy of democratic institutions within hybrid regimes as genuine platforms for public contestation or even mere tools to fortify autocratic governance. It focuses on the ideologies galvanizing political factions within Kuwait rather than exclusively examining institutional power structures, which I find quite interesting about the book. Dr. Freer utilizes the parliamentary elections as a lens to decipher the prevailing political ideologies shaping Kuwait since its independence. And I think there's a lot to unpack here that can really reflect on what's going on in Kuwait today. As we have witnessed, I believe, we have four elections within 4 years in Kuwait. And so this book is very timely. Um, and Before Courtney talks a little bit about her book, let me introduce her. So, Dr. Courtney Freer is a visiting assistant professor of Middle East Studies at Emory University. She previously served as assistant professorial research fellow at the Middle Eastern Center at London School of Economics and Political Science. Courtney's work focused on domestic politics and foreign policies of the Gulf states and the interplay of Islam and politics more broadly. She is the author of Rentier Islamism, The Influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gulf Monarchies, which was also published with Oxford University Press, just like this book. And she's also a co-author with Al-Anud al-Sharikh uh, for a book called Tribalism and Political Power in the Gulf, State Building and National Identity in Kuwait, Qatar, and UAE. Dr. Freer has a wealth of experience and knowledge covering Kuwaiti politics and overall broader Gulf politics. Without further ado, Courtney, could you just tell us a little bit about your book? I know that you wrote it during the pandemic, a big part of it, and you mentioned in your acknowledges that it's your arch nemesis and your roommate at the time. So I think everyone has this love-hate relationship with a book that they write because they spend so much alone time with it. So please tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write this book, and a little bit about what are the key elements of this book you would like to highlight for our audience.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dania. And thank you to Gulf International Forum for hosting me so that I can talk about my favorite topic, which is Kuwaiti politics. So thank you so much. And as you mentioned, I mean, with having so many parliamentary elections over the period that I was writing this, it was kind of constant battle of rewriting, re-editing. And then once I submitted it, of course, Parliament was dissolved in February. So, or once it was published. So it's difficult keeping track of everything that happens in Kuwait, but I'm trying to at least give something of an account of it. And I think that Kuwait presents a lot of scholars of the Middle East with a somewhat remarkable case study in the durability of commitment to parliamentary life. It is, of course, one of the wealthiest rentier monarchies and one of the most generous welfare states in the world. But at the same time, it houses this active and vocal parliament. Certainly, I would say the most active and vocal parliament in the Gulf Cooperation Council. And this legislature, in turn, features political actors from a wide variety of ideological and sociological backgrounds, including leftist, populist, Shia Islamist, Sunni Islamist, and tribal political blocs. And when other states in the Gulf have responded to calls from opposition movements for reform, largely by tightening the space for political maneuver, in Kuwait, even when restrictions have been put in place, and they have, parliament has remained central to political life. In fact, the two times that the emir dissolved the parliament in the past and failed to call for new elections as required by the constitution, which was between 1976 and 1981, and then between 1986 and 1992, popular agitation spurred its return, demonstrating the extent to which parliament is foundational to Kuwaiti political life and also to bolstering legitimacy of the political leadership there. So I think Kuwait has presented something of a puzzle for a lot of us who study rentier state theory, who study the Gulf states. Of course, if we're thinking of rentier state theory, it tends to summarize the totality of political life in oil-rich states using the phrase no taxation, no representation. And of course, when you look at Kuwait, this is certainly not the case. That having oil wealth does not necessarily prevent oil wealthy states from having domestic opposition movements, some of which are ideologically based, or from housing powerful institutions that allow for public participation in politics. And I think that Kuwait presents a great country case study to demonstrate the vitality of political life, both within and outside of institutions of the state, because we can look at these political ideologies which have helped to drive forward certain policies and certain protest movements in politics more generally. So Kuwait is distinctive in that sense as being this oil wealthy state which houses a very powerful and important parliament. It's also distinct among neighboring countries, at least in the GCC, because it has experienced in its recent history both invasion and occupation. So while external threats have shaped political life and both domestic and foreign policies to a limited extent, in the book I reject the idea that it was the irredentist threat from Iraq that led political legitimacy to be sought through an elected legislature. Other scholars, great scholars, have hypothesized that this threat from Iraq, which has been present since Kuwait's independence, has fundamentally shaped its domestic political system. And I do not consider external threats to have driven the formation of Kuwaiti government. And this is largely due to the fact that consultative politics were a part of pre-independence political life. Nonetheless, the experience of invasion and occupation has certainly colored domestic and particularly foreign policies of the Kuwaiti leadership. I think in both the domestic and foreign policy arenas, the Kuwaiti leadership kind of seeks to take what I would call like a middle path, particularly as foreign policy decisions often will have domestic corollaries. So, to give an example, Kuwait, of course, houses a politically active Muslim Brotherhood group, and it has not followed its neighbors, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in their banning of the Muslim Brotherhood. In 2014, those two countries designated the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Kuwait has not done the same, and also helped to kind of heal the rift between the Gulf states during the years of the blockade. And so despite the fact that in some ways Kuwait is unique, it's an oil wealthy state with an active parliament, it also has experienced invasion and occupation, we still lack, as Dania mentioned, a comprehensive political history of the country's parliament in English. We have a lot of past works on Kuwait that have focused on what parliament does and how it is situated within other organs of state power. But I would say that few studies, except from Marianne Tetro's 2000 book, Stories of Democracy, have sought to understand Kuwaiti citizens' deeply held political views and what motivates their political activity and their voting patterns. And so this book is an effort kind of to update that and to use the lens of parliamentary elections as a means of understanding the political ideologies and even the sociological drivers that have dominated in Kuwait since independence to the present day. As a result, it situates the dynamics of Kuwaiti politics within broader political science debates about whether democratic institutions in so-called hybrid regimes are meaningful areas for popular contestation. And so the book as a whole, I would say, has four primary goals, and we can unpack them a little more in the Q&A if that's of interest. So first, it places Kuwait's political system within these discussions about varieties of authoritarianism in broader political science literature from which it has in some ways been excluded. So past work by people like Jennifer Gandhi and others has characterized Kuwait as essentially autocratic, albeit with some democratic institutions. And so in my book, I complicate this by bringing in not only the institution of parliament, but also the wide range of political factions and actors which place value on Kuwaiti democracy or democratic institutions in the state. And so it's complicating this idea that sees Kuwait solely as a straightforwardly authoritarian system in which the state essentially buys off opposition. And so that I push back against and place Kuwait within that broader set of literature. Second, I trace the currents of political thought in a state where grassroots political action is often treated as irrelevant, or at least centered on this materialistic rent-seeking behavior. So both rentier state theory and elite-centric theories of authoritarian rule have tended to obscure the intellectual histories of political mobilization within the Gulf states. And so the Gulf is not exceptional in terms of what political ideologies have been in terms of the fact that political ideologies that have been relevant elsewhere in the Middle East have also been relevant in the Gulf. I think that sometimes we look at things like at ideologies like Arab nationalism or Islamism, and we don't necessarily think that they'll travel to these oil wealthy states of the Gulf, but they do. And there's some really exciting work being done on this in the Gulf about intellectual history and placing Kuwait within a broader regional intellectual history. Third, this work updates existing literature on the political history of Kuwait. There's a lot of new work coming out now, particularly focusing on diwaniyat and cooperatives, as well as intellectual history. But we haven't seen a book like this or a study like this in book form since Marianne Tétreau's book, which I had mentioned earlier, and that was published about 2 decades ago. And so in a sense, I'm trying to do a bit of an update since that book. Fourth, and perhaps most broadly, I engage with debates about the comparative mobilizational advantage of political groups based on ideology versus ascriptive identity. I do this by tracing the relative political influence of the variety of Islamist, secular, and tribal actors in Kuwaiti politics. Indeed, Kuwait is unique in that it houses a variety of Islamist blocs, both Sunni and Shia, as well as very organized and politically effective, I would say, tribal blocs, all of which compete for votes. And so I think that Kuwait really presents us a valuable opportunity to study a wide variety of types of actors and for us to question the extent to which tribal groups have an advantage in elections over, say, ideologically based groups. And I think this study can help us make meaningful cross-country comparisons, say, to a place like Jordan, which also houses both powerful tribal groups as well as Islamist groups. So overall, I would say working on Kuwait has led me to see ways in which this country as a case study really contributes to our understanding of a lot of things. And I think there are three major areas of interest within political science broadly that Kuwait can help us understand more. And I've mentioned all of them, but these three are first, the role of ideology in politics, which I've mentioned, particularly when it comes to Islam or Islamism. Secondly, the role of rents and rentierism, whether oil money can effectively buy off opposition. And third, the role of international context on domestic politics. And it's my hope that this book advances our understanding of these three areas, both in relation to the Kuwaiti case and maybe in bringing the Kuwaiti case in conversation with other country cases as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Courtney, for that comprehensive overview. of the book sounds fascinating. And I know that you try to link the Kuwaiti case. Actually, you duly link the Kuwaiti case to the broader literature on authoritarianism. And I wanted to ask about um, a general global trend that we're seeing, the rise of authoritarianism in general, and the backsliding of democracies globally. And that we also are seeing that in the Middle East as well. And so, how do you? I know part of your title is resilience about the Kuwait's parliament. So, how do you explain Kuwait's resilience in this broader trend? And perhaps you can uh, bring some points up from your book about that.
Yeah, great question. And I guess I would answer it in two primary ways. So, of course, the rise of authoritarianism globally is something worth talking about, worth noting. And I think that when we look at the Kuwaiti case, two things kind of distinguish it. I would say the first is the political history of Kuwait, which I go into a little bit in the book. The fact that from early on, from 1938 with the Merchants Majlis, there's been this desire for or a sense or a sense that citizens have a right to representation within the government. And I think that's fundamentally different from the way that other states in the Middle East have been founded or have operated historically. And secondly, I think that when we have seen an increase in authoritarianism, when we've seen political space shrinking to a certain extent in Kuwait, for instance, people being stripped of their citizenship or people being jailed for political crimes. When that has happened, there has been a reaction from the street and also from these various ideological movements, basically to come together and to call for change. So the Karamat Watan protests back in 2012 were an example of mass protests that spanned a variety of ideological and sociological lines because there was a feeling that this was needed. And I think that the state is relatively reactive to that. So I think you see in the case of Kuwaiti opposition, you have a broad ideologically based opposition, and I think that when political space tightens, it is easier for them in some ways to set aside some of their ideological differences. So I wrote a piece a few years back talking about what I call exclusion moderation, and the idea that the more that political groups feel excluded from a political system, the more willing they are to moderate their agendas. And we've seen this with some Islamist groups setting aside things like the issue of gender segregation at Kuwait University, setting that aside for the moment back in 2013, 2012, 2013, to focus on issues of political reform, which were seen as more pressing. So I think that the opposition is reactive, and I also think the state has proven to be relatively reactive as well.
I'm sorry, I'm on mute. And thank you for that. So, talking about theories that focus on the Gulf, I know one that many have addressed is the Rentier state theory, and it's been challenged by many. And I read also in the book. I mean, you push quite strongly against the Rentier state theory as well. Um, could you talk about what do you think is relevant from it to your argument, and what aspects of Rentier state theory you think is not relevant, and other theoretical perspectives focused on the Gulf as well?
Yeah, so when it comes to rentier state theory, I mean, it's logical, right? It makes sense on the face of it. You have a state which benefits from massive oil rents and therefore is the primary economic and political actor in the state. I think what I and a lot of other scholars take issue with is this idea that economy is the determinant of political behaviors. The idea that just because a state benefits from oil rents, this means that it will be authoritarian or there will be no opposition of any type. And I think my first book pushed back on that by saying, well, if this is the case, why do Islamist opposition groups emerge? So I think that's the piece of it that I find not terribly helpful. I do think, though, we still can't ignore that the state is still holds the primary assets, right? So the state still is the recipient of these oil rents. And so the way in which those rents are dispersed is just the way in which they are dispersed really has a major political has major political consequences. So we do see debates in Parliament, very heated debates about, for instance, pushing back against austerity measures. So certain MPs will basically say that people will need a raise, but there should be an increased salary for civil servants, for instance. And so this kind of seems to confirm, in a sense, what rentier state theory is saying about the central role of the state as the primary economic actor. But at the same time, this is not the only type of debate that's really happening in Kuwaiti parliament. Yes, there is this difficulty in terms of diversifying away from oil wealth because it's very difficult to get parliament to vote in favor of taking back disbursements that go to its constituents. But at the same time, there are ideological drivers of political action in the Gulf that I don't think that rentier state theory really allows for. Um, so I think it's helpful in a sense, but not so helpful in others. And I guess that's kind of the main Gulf related theory that I interact with in the book. I talk a bit about the idea of hybrid regimes and the extent to which, a lot when a lot of political scientists look at hybrid regimes, they seem to focus more on the authoritarian side, on the regime politics side, and I'm focusing much more on the parliamentary side, but also the uninstitutionalized ways in which political life happens in Kuwait: diwaniyat, protests, cooperatives, things like this.
Great. And so I think let's talk a little bit about ideology. What I liked about this book is how it was organized. It was chronological, and it talked about the role of ideology and the parliament through various decades, I believe, starting from the 1970s. Um, and so, could you tell me how does ideology mobilize political groups in Kuwait? What were the key takeaways you think from the book in reference to this? I don't know if you perhaps want to go decade by decade very briefly, or if there's an overall takeaway for the whole book. Um, Please.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, so I think that one of the reasons that I wanted to look at ideology specifically is that you hear a lot in Kuwait about this idea that people only vote for people on the whom they think will secure them oil money, or B, the idea that people will only vote for people to whom they're related. So the idea that tribalism or rentierism drives votes, and so that's why I wanted to look at ideology. So essentially, I start kind of with Arab nationalism, with the links that Arab nationalists in Kuwait had with Arab nationalists elsewhere. Talal al-Rashid has done some really fantastic work on this, on linking Kuwaiti nationalists, Arab nationalists, with Palestinian Arab nationalists, for instance. And so it's this idea that you have an Arab nationalist movement indigenous to Kuwait, which is doing things like in the 1950s pushing back against the British protectorate system. And so in the 1960s, the primary opposition to the state is this Arab nationalist movement. Over the course of the 70s, we see the rise, and this is not just in Kuwait, this is kind of a regional thing more generally, we see the rise of Islamist movements, the increase in popularity at the end of the 1970s, in particular, of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1981, we see the first Salafi groups entering electoral life in Kuwait as well. And so you see a flourishing of Islamist, somewhat oppositional movements, I would say, in the end of the 1970s through 80s and 90s. And so essentially, I'm tracing that and how the ways in which the groups that were oppositional kind of shifted. So in the 60s, the government was more worried about Arab nationalists than about Islamists. This shifts later on into the 70s, 80s. And then I talk a little bit more about kind of how all of these groups came together during the Iraqi invasion. And there was this sense of unity for a brief moment. And then over the course of the 90s, you do have this division between kind of Islamists and more secular leaning parties within parliament. But I think what we've seen, I would say, in the past couple of decades is really this movement away. Of course, there are still going to be Islamist movements which focus very heavily on social policy issues. Back in 2022, there was a so-called values document that was released by several Salafi members of or candidates for parliament, many of whom were elected, which basically opined that Kuwait needed to change its social policies to do things like demand gender segregation, criminalize tattoos. There were a variety of measures. So there are still these Islamist strands that are very strong and very important, but I do think that in times when the government is seen to have overstepped in terms of cracking down on opposition, this is when we see this broad-based political opposition come to the fore and unite a little bit more effectively. I do think one of the problems that we see now is, I guess, in defining opposition, because there are many varieties of opposition in Kuwait. So every headline about a Kuwaiti election says the opposition wins big, but then it becomes clear that it's difficult for these various segments of the opposition to work together. They'll work together to question ministers in parliament or to block certain policies, but there are clearly cracks in this. And so that's becoming, I would say, an issue now is, kind of how to create a more unified opposition that can actually be more effective in policy making. So I think over the years we've seen this shift in terms of what drives political mobilization. There are still ideological drivers. There are leftist groups that talk a lot about the need for democratic equality, for equality of all peoples. And then you also have Islamist groups, which are saying very similar things, but for different reasons and using different language. And so I think there have been some fractures there, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how this develops moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, it will be very interesting to see how this develops moving forward. And I find you assessing the ideological inclinations of in Kuwait and in the parliament to be quite intriguing. And I was wondering how, for example, let's take it into one of the major regional issues going on, the Gaza War. How do you think that has the ideological leniencies of individuals in the parliament would respond to that? I know we're still there's not a parliament, an active parliament right now, so you might not be able to assess that fully. But in your view, how do you think the response would be? And do you feel like there's a sense of unity? How much do you think that is something taken into account by members of the parliament and voters as well?
Yeah, great question. I think this is probably one issue on which a lot of MPs seem to agree, at least in the former parliament, and I think historically as well. Tyler Parker wrote a short piece about Kuwaiti support for Palestinians generally, and talked a lot about the historical connections between Palestinians and Kuwaitis, the large number of Palestinians who had lived in Kuwait, particularly prior to the Gulf War. And so there are these regional connections that exist and that do matter, and that still seem to matter. So Kuwaiti Parliament has taken a very strong stance, strong anti-Israel stance. Has basically there have been statements made. I forget who exactly had said it. This was years back, saying that Kuwait would be the last to normalize with Israel. This was around the time of the Abraham Accords, and I think that this is one area in which the government is in agreement with Parliament. So there's one. So it's this idea essentially that defending or speaking out in favor of or in defense of Palestine is viewed, I think, as somewhat an Arab responsibility, or this idea of this is something that's important on a regional level, and so I think that's kind of how it's couched, kind of in those terms. I would say both in Kuwaiti Parliament and among the unelected leadership. So Kuwaiti Parliament had passed a boycott bill before October 7th. So there had already been support within Parliament for very strongly pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli kind of stances, and so I think that has kind of been maintained since October 7th, and we see the government also in agreement largely with Parliament in terms of calling for a ceasefire, and not really working with Israel, or not being willing to work with Israel in the way that some of the neighboring states have been. So I think this is one case in which the history matters, historical ties matter, and also this idea of identifying Palestinian nationalism as an Arab cause, as a regional cause that should be, or is in the case of Kuwait, seen as something important to Kuwaitis, just as it is to other people in the region.
Yeah, and so you do think it's still related. There's still a residue of Arab nationalism there when it comes to the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, I think there's at least, yeah, I think there's a little bit of at least unity around this cause. I don't know if that it goes much deeper than that. I wouldn't say we're going to see a revival of like pan-Arabism, but I wouldn't go that far. But I do think that there is unity on that, in that sense. And yeah.
And speaking of resilience, the question that's on everyone's mind is how can you get the government and the legislative branch kind of come to an agreement and actually keep the parliament going for a few years, its full term, to get important business done for the Kuwaiti people. And how do you see this, the dissolving of parliament or other mechanisms which um, essentially dissolve the parliament? How do you see that um, feeding into this idea of the resilience of the Kuwaiti parliament?
Yeah, so when my book came out, I was talking to some people about Kuwaiti politics, and they said, "Oh, it's really brave that you use the word resilience, because like, is it actually resilient? What actually is going to happen?" We hear a lot of rumors about, that perhaps changes to the constitution could be made. There's a lot of rumors always, but there is speculation about the extent to which the institution actually is resilient. I do think, I mean, what we've seen since elections have been called, we do see a lot of candidates registering. We see the start of active campaigning. I think the fear that I had was that there would be electoral fatigue, that people would basically not see the utility of running for parliament, or not see the utility of voting for parliament, just for it to be dissolved within a few months. But I don't think we're seeing that. In a lot of the campaigning materials that I've seen over the past few weeks, it seems that there's a focus on protecting the Constitution and protecting Parliament as a part of the constitutional arrangement. So I do think there's a commitment to having a parliament, even if it's imperfect. And I think that one thing that was happening in the previous parliament that was important was this changing of electoral laws. So drafting new electoral laws. The opposition has long wanted to get rid of the single non-transferable vote system, because that makes it very difficult for groups to coordinate their votes when everyone only gets one vote. And so if there could be movement towards potentially shifting some ways in which the voting is managed, or the ways in which elections are held, whether that's changing the single non-transferable vote system, whether that's bringing in a gender quota, whatever that is, I think that could potentially help ease tensions. But I do think one of the underlying issues as well, and is the idea that the one major tool of the opposition is the grillings of ministers. And so you will have these grillings of ministers. Sometimes this will lead to resignations, other times it will lead to dissolution of the cabinet. And so I think that when grillings are focused on too much, it means that there's much more time spent on those than there is on like actual policy making, things like shifting electoral law in a way that makes it, that changes the dynamics a bit. So I think that moving forward, that could be something really important to see shift. And that is something that was being worked on kind of previously. Also, the Emir's speech back in December, I mean, he made clear that he was unhappy with the fact that the cabinet and the parliament were not getting along and were not getting things done, and called both of those bodies out, which is really interesting and really important. So there is, everyone knows that the system is not as efficient as it could be. What we're not agreed upon, or what everyone is not agreed upon, however, is how to make it more efficient. I don't think that a move towards dissolution of parliament for a long time will be the answer. Though some people may disagree with that. But I think that we may see kind of incremental reforms, incremental changes over time, and also this sense that the opposition now is united in wanting to protect parliament and wanting to preserve the representative part of the government, really.
And so how do you foresee, so you did mention the emir's speech in December and his frustration towards the parliament, which I think is rightly so. I think not only the emir is frustrated, I think the Kuwaitis are also very frustrated with how things have went forward. So how do you see, let's say, the cabinet and the parliament move forward under the new emir? You talked about incremental changes. What sort of changes do you foresee?
Good question. I mean, one of these would be potentially changes to the electoral system, to electoral law. Another change is the composition of cabinet. So how many elected MPs, for instance, are members of cabinet? I think when Sheikh Ahmed al-Fahd was appointed to cabinet, not this last one, but the one previous, I think people thought that was kind of a message sent to the opposition, that there was someone who was kind of seen as, in some ways, as an outsider of the ruling family, and somewhat popular among opposition figures. I think some people viewed that positively and viewed that as a potential step towards kind of building bridges with parliament. So I think if the composition of cabinet changes in such a way that parliament feel, opposition members of parliament, who will be the majority again, I would assume, so that they feel that they can work more productively with this cabinet. So they see it as kind of potentially a partner rather than an enemy. In terms of whom exactly should be appointed in that case, that's a much more difficult question. But I do think that even appointing fewer members of the ruling family could be seen as and trying to integrate more elected MPs could be seen as a step towards reaching out to parliament.
And so let's talk about important groups. Now, I mean, we talked a lot about ideology so far. What about the role of tribes? I know you have a recent book about tribes, and you do address tribes in your book as well, and perhaps even the role of business elite in the politics of the parliament. How do you see their role changing, and also how do you see their role in this upcoming election?
Yeah, so I think that the tribal vote is really fascinating. So when you look at the way that the Kuwaiti electoral map is drawn up, districts 4 and 5 are the primary outlying districts farther away from Kuwait City, and these are the districts in which tribal groups tend to do quite well. I think there was some concern when single non-transferable vote system was put in place that this would harm the ability of tribes to coordinate their votes. And Andrew Lieber and I wrote a paper examining this question, and we found that, in the initial vote after the new system was put in place, we did see smaller tribes winning more seats over larger tribes, potentially because of the easier voter coordination. But now we have seen that tribes have adjusted to this, and there are still a fair number of the representatives, especially from districts 4 and 5, do come from tribal groups, so are represented as tribal groups. One thing that's also interesting is that the government seems to be keen on cracking down on tribal primaries. So tribal primaries are basically a way that tribes can informally but formally and technically illegally coordinate their votes. And so we've seen in recent years the government's insisting that it will crack down on these tribal primaries through the Ministry of Interior. This has happened in the past, and has happened potentially because the tribal groups have become increasingly part of the opposition. So when tribal groups were not a part of the opposition, there was less of a focus on trying to kind of crack down on these primaries. That, however, has shifted. So tribal groups are still quite important. What's also interesting is that, when we look at the candidates from these tribal districts, you also have some who are Salafi, who have kind of other type of ideological background, so aren't just representatives of a tribe. So there can be this coexisting loyalties in a sense between kind of the ascriptive identity and the more ideological identity as well. In terms of the business elites, this is a really it's interesting because early on, business elites and kind of the merchant class were seen as the group that was most oppositional to the state, the group that kind of held the ruling family to account, that demanded things like the Merchants' Majlis back in 1938, that demanded a parliament later on, and were very involved in Arab nationalism. As time has gone on, however, the perception is that these merchant elites have become more loyalist, or have become closer to the state, at least in some sense. And I think that may be shifting a little bit now, but I think in terms of ability to organize votes, tribal groups are much more effective than I would say the merchant groups, because there's more history of organization through tribal primaries. There's also the benefit of geography, where a lot of members of certain tribes will live in the same district, so it's easier to campaign there. Whereas the merchant elite, it would be a little bit more spread out in terms of geography, but also in terms of ideological affinity, et cetera.
I always mute myself. Thank you. That was quite interesting. I am interested to know that you said you see a sort of shift with reference to the merchants, and how they are, I guess, becoming less loyalist to the government, or how would you characterize it?
So I'm not sure the extent to which that I would say that's like a broad standing. I'm not sure whether that is going to be generalizable. I think a lot about the figure of Marzouk al Ghanem, right? So the idea that he was seen as this very loyalist business elite character, Speaker of Parliament, and then over time has been seen as distancing himself, at least from the new emir. So I'm not sure whether that speaks to a broader trend that we may see of merchants becoming less loyalist, but I think that the conventional wisdom has been that there has been a switch in terms of, tribes used to be loyalist and now they're more oppositional,
Oh, I
and then
see.
merchants are more kind of connected to the state, because if they're connected to the state, they can benefit from state contracts, et cetera. So we will see, I suppose.
Right. I mean, still, everything is unclear at this point. I mean, the elections haven't really started yet. So we definitely would love to see what will happen after the election. So one of your colleagues here, Michael Herb, who we just saw at Gulf Studies Symposium, he did ask a question about this particular election. I mean, we did address a little bit about tribal primaries. In this particular election, he asks, "Have you seen evidence of tribal primaries, um, and or has the government succeeded in repressing them? Oh, have you noticed anything right now?"
Yes. So I was just trying to find the exact statement. So basically, at the end of February, the Interior Minister said that the Ministry of Interior basically would crack down on any illegal primaries and any vote buying. And so this was something that had come up in Parliament when Parliament was trying to come up with this new kind of electoral commission and different oversight body rather than the Ministry of Interior. That hasn't happened yet, and so it seems that the Ministry of Interior is taking the lead in terms of saying that they will crack down on the primaries. In terms of evidence that reports of primaries being cracked down on, I haven't seen anything. I know that in the 2022 election, it seemed like every time there was one cracked down upon it, there was like a news story about it. But I haven't seen that. I just know that there is this statement in general about the government not being willing to put up with this. Also, I think, I mean, because we have this campaigning during Ramadan, it makes it easier to have these like informal settings, a sahur or an iftar, that could potentially also be a place of talking politics.
Yes, actually, that is a good point. I mean, there are gatherings that happened, and we'll see how candidates use that as a strategic way to market themselves. And Courtney, could you tell us where can we find your book? So if people were interested in purchasing it, since we're on a virtual book talk, we don't have the book stacked in front of us.
Yeah, I do have one, but yeah, so it's on Amazon, or through the Oxford University Press website, but Amazon's probably the easiest.
Excellent. Well, I highly recommend you all to get the book. I actually have a copy here myself. Um, the Resilience of Parliamentary Politics in Kuwait, Parliament, Rentierism, and Society. Please check it out. It certainly will be on my courses syllabus on Gulf Studies. Courtney, is there anything else you would like to add before we adjourn?
No, I think that's it. Thank you so much. Thanks again for having me.
It's our pleasure to have you, Courtney. We're very fortunate to have you as a non-resident scholar with us, and we look forward to engaging with this more through different forums. And thank you all. Ramadan Mubarak to those of you celebrating. Take care.